"Dance with me," said the Duke of Kieran, in the tone of a man conferring a favor upon the undeserving. And Miss Isabel Crane looked at his extended hand as though he had offered her a dead fish, and said, clearly enough for the nearest 50 people to hear, "No, thank you." The music did not stop, but a great many conversations did. For no one refused the Duke of Kieran. He was the most powerful man at court after the king himself, the richest, the most feared, and, it must be admitted, the most sought after. For he was also darkly handsome in a cold, forbidding way, and every unmarried woman in 3 kingdoms had spent years angling for exactly the attention he had just, astonishingly, bestowed upon a nobody. And the nobody had refused him, flatly, in the middle of the court ball, in front of the assembled aristocracy of the realm. A penniless girl of no family had looked at the hand of the Duke of Kieran and declined it, as though declining a second helping of pudding. The Duke did not move. His hand remained extended, and his cold face registered, in sequence, disbelief, affront, and a slow, dangerous displeasure. He was not accustomed to the word no. He had, in fact, not heard it directed at himself in some 15 years, and he found he did not know quite what to do with it. "I beg your pardon," he said. "Perhaps you did not hear me. I asked you to dance." "I heard you perfectly, Your Grace," said Isabel Crane, "and I thanked you, and I declined. I am sure it was very civil of you to ask, and I do not doubt that every other woman in this room would faint with joy to be asked, and you are welcome to ask any of them. But I would rather not dance with you, and I did not think you would wish me to dance with you while wishing I were elsewhere, for that would be no compliment to either of us. So I have saved us both the trouble. No, thank you, truly, but thank you." It was, the court agreed afterward, the most extraordinary thing anyone had witnessed in a decade, and the most suicidal. For a girl in Isabel Crane's position did not refuse a duke. A girl in Isabel Crane's position could be crushed by a duke's mere displeasure, cut from every invitation, frozen out of every house, ruined by a raised eyebrow. Isabel Crane was a poor relation attending court in the train of her wealthy cousin, Lady Marchbanks. She had no fortune, no consequence, no protector beyond a cousin who tolerated her as unpaid companion. She survived entirely on the sufferance of the great, and she had just, in front of the entire court, spat in the eye of the greatest of them all. The Duke of Kieran withdrew his hand, slowly. "You would rather not," he repeated. "I would rather not. May I ask why?" His voice had gone very quiet, which those who knew him understood to be far more dangerous than shouting. "I confess, I am curious. Women considerably above your station have schemed for years to receive the invitation you have just thrown back in my face. I should like to understand what it is about my company that you find so objectionable, miss. I do not even know your name, which rather proves my point about your station, that you would prefer public ruin to a single dance with me. Enlighten me." And Isabel Crane, who had nothing to lose, and had apparently decided to lose it magnificently, lifted her chin and told him, "My name is Isabel Crane, Your Grace, and I will tell you exactly why, since you ask, though you will not like it, and I will very likely be sorry tomorrow. Half an hour ago, I watched you speak to old Lady Everly, the deaf one, in the gray silk, who is 80 and frightened of these grand rooms, and comes only because her son makes her. I watched you find her tiresome, and I watched you turn from her mid-sentence, while she was still speaking, and walk away, and leave her standing there, confused and ashamed, in front of everyone, because she was old and deaf and dull, and could do nothing for you. And then, 20 minutes later, you crossed the room to ask me to dance. Me, a nobody, which puzzled me until I understood it. You asked me because I am the only young woman here who has not chased you, and you are a man so accustomed to being chased that the one creature who ignores you becomes the only one you want. So you came to collect me, the way you collect everything, as your due. And I found, Your Grace, that I could not bring myself to dance with a man I had just watched humiliate a frightened old woman for the crime of being dull. That is why. It is not your company in the abstract I object to. It is that I saw what you did to Lady Everly, and I decided that a man who treats the powerless like that is not a man whose hand I care to take, whatever the cost to me. There. You asked. I have answered. You may ruin me now. I am quite aware you can, and I imagine you will. But I would rather be ruined and have refused you than be safe and have danced with the man who walked away from Lady Everley." The silence around them had become total. The Duke of Cairn stood very still, and Isabel watched something move across his cold face that she could not read. Not the fury she had braced for, but something stranger, something that looked almost like a man being shown his own reflection, and not liking it. She had expected rage. She had expected the cold, annihilating displeasure that ended careers and reputations. She had not expected him to go quiet and thoughtful and, she could not be sure, faintly, terribly ashamed. "Lady Everley," the Duke said, at last. "The lady in grey silk. Yes." He looked across the room to where old Lady Everley sat now, small and forgotten by the wall. He looked back at Isabel, and then the Duke of Cairn did a thing that astonished the court even more than the refusal had. He bowed to Isabel Crane, a short, precise, genuine bow, the bow of a man acknowledging a hit, and he said, "Thank you, Miss Crane. You have told me something no one has dared to tell me in 15 years, and I find, to my considerable annoyance, that you are entirely right, and that I am ashamed. You need not dance with me. You are quite correct that you should not. Excuse me." And he turned and walked, not away, but across the room, straight to old Lady Everley, and sat himself down beside her, and gave the deaf old woman his complete and courteous attention for a full half-hour, in front of the whole astonished court, speaking loudly and patiently and kindly, until the old lady was pink with pleasure, and the entire room had been forced to watch the Duke of Cairn publicly unmake his own cruelty, because a nobody had shamed him into it. Isabel Crane watched him do it, and felt the ground shift under her, because she had expected a monster, and had refused a monster, and had been fully prepared to be ruined by a monster, and instead, she had somehow provoked a proud, cold man into an act of public penance, which was not a thing monsters did, and which meant that the Duke of Cairn was something more complicated and more dangerous than a monster, and she was not at all sure what to do about it. She would find out, and so would he. For the Duke of Cairn walked home under the stars that night, in a state he had not been in for 15 years. Turned inside out, unsettled, unable to stop thinking about a penniless girl who had looked at his extended hand and told him the truth. And he understood, somewhere between the palace and his own great door, that he had gone to that ball the most sought-after man in 3 kingdoms, and left it having, for the first time in his adult life, been genuinely refused, genuinely rebuked, and genuinely seen, and that he had fallen, hard and completely, and against every intention, for the one woman in the realm who did not want him. Isabel, meanwhile, went home to be roundly abused by her cousin. Lady Marchbanks had witnessed the whole scene from across the ballroom, and she spent the entire carriage ride home in a state of near hysteria, alternating between visions of her own social ruin, for a poor relation's disgrace splashes upward onto the family that harbors her, and sheer incredulity that any creature so dependent could have been so mad. "Do you know what you have done?" she demanded for the 4th time. "You have insulted the Duke of Cairn, in front of the court. He will destroy us, Isabel. Not just you, us. We will not be received anywhere. My daughter's prospects, my own position, everything I have built, thrown away because you would not dance one dance. One dance. What possessed you? What could possibly have possessed you?" "He was cruel to Lady Everley," Isabel said, for the 4th time, quietly, watching the dark streets go by. "Lady Everley is a deaf old woman who does not matter to anyone." "Yes," said Isabel. "That is rather the point, cousin. She does not matter to anyone, which is exactly why someone ought to mind how she is treated, since no one else will. But I am sorry, truly, for the trouble I have brought on you. That was not fair to you, and I did not think of it in the moment, and I ought to have. If the Duke ruins us, I will leave your house, and take the ruin with me as much as I can, and go, I do not know where, but somewhere, so that it falls on me, and not on your girls. I will not have your daughters suffer for my temper. That much I can promise you." And Lady Marchbanks, who was a shallow woman, but not entirely a bad one, was silenced for a moment by that, by the readiness of the penniless girl to take the whole weight of the consequences onto herself, rather than let it touch the cousins who had housed her. And she looked at Isabel with something that was almost, for a moment, respect, before her fear reasserted itself, and she went back to lamenting. But Isabel did not sleep that night. She lay awake in her small, cold room at the top of her cousin's house, the poor relations' room, exactly the sort of room the heroines of these tales always occupy. And she faced, honestly, what she had done, and what it would cost, and whether she regretted it. She was not a fool. She knew her position. She knew that a girl with nothing survives entirely on the goodwill of the great, and that she had just thrown that goodwill away with both hands, and that the sensible, the safe, the survivable thing would have been to dance the dance, smile the smile, and keep her opinions about Lady Everley to herself, as she had kept 1,000 opinions to herself over years of dependent silence. And she found, examining it in the dark, that she did not regret it. That was the thing that surprised her. She had expected to lie awake sick with fear and remorse, and instead, she lay awake strangely light, strangely free, because she had done, for once in her careful dependent life, the thing she actually believed was right, out loud, at cost, and it had felt, despite the terror of the consequences, like the first fully honest act of her adult life. She had spent years being small and pleasant and grateful, swallowing every true thing she thought, because that was what a poor relation must do to survive. And tonight she had, for one reckless moment, stopped swallowing, and spoken, and defended a defenseless woman, and let the chips fall, and whatever it cost her, she thought, she would rather pay it than go back to the swallowing. A person could survive poverty, and dependence, and even ruin. What Isabel was no longer certain she could survive was a lifetime of being silent, while cruelty was done to people who could not defend themselves. She had found her limit. It had cost her, probably, everything, and she did not regret it, and she thought she never would. And that certainty, hard-won, in a cold room, at the likely price of her whole future, was the thing that made her, though she did not know it yet, exactly the woman the Duke of Kirin was, at that same hour, walking the dark streets unable to stop thinking about. Two people, awake in the same night, in very different rooms, each remade by the same 30 seconds, and neither of them yet suspecting that the refusal which was supposed to end Isabel Crane's prospects forever had in fact just begun the great romance of both their lives. The court expected Isabel Crane to be destroyed within the week. Instead, the Duke of Kirin began, to the scandalized fascination of everyone, to court her. It was the most incompetent courtship the court had ever witnessed, and the most sincere. For the Duke of Kirin had spent 15 years being pursued, and had therefore never once had to pursue anyone, and he approached the problem the only way he knew, which was directly and coldly, and with a complete absence of the arts other men used, and it went wrong at nearly every turn. And Isabel, watching him blunder, found herself first amused, then intrigued, then, against every scrap of her own good sense, charmed. He began by sending her things, extravagant things, jewels, silks, a mare of impeccable breeding, because giving expensive gifts was, in his experience, how one signaled favor, and he had no notion that to a poor gentlewoman, such gifts were not flattering but insulting, a way of pricing her, of making her a kept thing. Isabel sent every one of them back, with a note that grew tarder each time, until the third note read simply, "Your Grace, I am not a horse to be acquired, though I note you have sent me one. I refused your hand. I am hardly likely to accept your bribes. If you wish to know me, you will have to do the tedious work of actually speaking to me, like an ordinary person, which I realize is beneath your dignity and beyond your experience. But there it is, yours in continued refusal, I, Crane." The Duke of Kirin read that note 4 times, and then, for the first time in the memory of his household, laughed aloud and put the note in his breast pocket where it stayed. So he stopped sending gifts, and he did the tedious work. He sought her out, at court, at the houses where her cousin dragged her, in the park where she walked, and he spoke to her, like an ordinary person, which he was catastrophically bad at first, being a man who had forgotten how to converse rather than command. And Isabel, who had a sharp tongue and no reason left to guard it, gave him no quarter, corrected him, argued with him, mocked his grand manners, refused to be impressed. And the Duke of Cairn, who had been surrounded his whole life by people too frightened to tell him anything true, discovered that being argued with by Isabel Crane was the most exhilarating experience of his life, better than any flattery, because it was real, and he was starved half to death for something real. They fought about everything. They fought about the treatment of the poor, on which Isabel had fierce opinions, and the Duke had never had any at all, and she made him have them, and, more than that, made him act on them, so that within 2 months, the Duke of Cairn had, at Isabel Crane's needling, done more for the tenants and dependents in his power than he had done in the whole of his previous life, not to impress her, or not only, but because she had made him see them, the way she had made him see Lady Everley. And once a man has been made to see, he cannot easily unsee. She was remaking him. She did not entirely intend to, and he did not entirely notice. But the cold, cruel, proud Duke of Cairn was becoming, week by week, under the lash of a penniless girl's tongue, a better man, kinder, more just, more awake. And the change was so marked that the court, which had known him for a monster, began to murmur that the Crane girl had bewitched him, which was nearer the truth than the court knew, for the bewitchment was mutual and total. There was one afternoon that changed the Duke of Cairn more than all the arguments together, and it changed him because Isabel made him look. She had challenged him, in the course of one of their fights, to name a single one of his own tenants, just one, by name, the people whose labor kept him in silk and consequence. And the Duke of Cairn, master of 40,000 acres, had opened his mouth and discovered that he could not. He knew his horses by name. He knew his hounds by name. He did not know the name of one single human being whose rent built his fortune. And Isabel had looked at him with a quiet, devastating pity, not contempt, which he could have borne, but pity, and said, 40,000 acres, your grace, and you do not know the name of one soul who works them. You know your dogs. Do you not see what that says about you? Not that you are cruel. I no longer think you cruel, but that you have never once looked. The people beneath you are less real to you than your spaniels. That is not wickedness. It is worse in a way. It is a kind of blindness that thinks itself normal. And then, because she was Isabel, she had added, I could not marry a blind man, whatever else he was. So if you wish me to think better of you, your grace, do not send me another horse. Go and learn their names. He went and learned their names. He did it the way he did everything, thoroughly and grimly, at first as a task set by a woman he wished to impress. But it did not stay a task, because you cannot learn a man's name without learning, a little, his troubles, and you cannot learn his troubles without beginning, whether you will or no, to care. The Duke of Cairn spent a fortnight riding his own lands, not as the master surveying his property, but as a man meeting his neighbors, and he came back to Isabel changed, in a way that frightened them both, because he came back not with a list of names memorized to please her, but with a kind of horror at himself. I did not know, he told her, and his cold voice was not steady. Isabel, I did not know how they lived, on my own land, in my own name. There is a family, the Hobbs family. The roof of their cottage has been failing for 3 years, and the man applied to my steward twice, and was refused, and I never heard of it, because why would the Duke of Cairn be troubled about a roof? And their youngest died of the damp last winter, on my land, in a house I own that I would not permit my dogs to sleep in, and I never knew, and if I had known a month ago, I am not certain I would have cared, and that is the thing I cannot get past. That a month ago a child died of my neglect, and I would have found the matter tedious. What have I been, Isabel? 40,000 acres of people I have treated as scenery, while I was waited on and flattered and called great. You ask me to learn their names. I have learned their names, and I find I can never again be the man who did not know them. You have ruined me. You have made me see, and I cannot unsee, and it is the most painful thing that has ever happened to me, and I would not go back to the blindness for anything in the world, and I do not know whether to thank you or to curse you. And Isabel Crane looked at the Duke of Kern, genuinely stricken, genuinely changed, a proud, cold man broken open by the simple act of learning some names, and felt the last of her own defenses begin to give way, because this was not a man performing goodness to win her. A man performing goodness does not come back gray and shaking with horror at himself over a dead child on his land. This was a man actually being remade, from the inside, painfully, permanently, and she had done it, not with jewels or flattery, but with a challenge and a refusal, and she understood that whatever else the Duke of Kern was, or had been, he was now a man capable of being changed by the truth, which is the rarest and most hopeful quality a person can have. "You mend the Hobbs roof," she said gently, "and every other roof like it, not to impress me, but because you have seen, and seeing requires it. And then, Your Grace, you will not be the man I refused any more. You are already not quite him. I find—" She stopped and looked away, because it was more than she had meant to say. "I find I like the man you are becoming a great deal better, and it is becoming rather inconvenient to my determination to keep refusing you, and I will thank you to stop being so improvable, as it is playing havoc with my resolve." And the Duke of Kern had laughed, the startled real laugh she had first drawn out of him, and gone off to mend the Hobbs roof, and Isabel had watched him go and known, with a sinking, soaring certainty, that she was losing the fight against her own heart, and that she did not, any longer, very much want to win it. But Isabel would not let herself trust it. That was the knot at the center of the courtship, and it was a real one. Because Isabel Crane had refused the Duke of Kern, precisely because he was a man who collected what ignored him. And she could not shake the fear that that was still all this was, that she was a novelty, the one woman who had said no, and that a man like the Duke of Kern wanted her only because she was the one thing he had not been able to have, and that the moment she yielded, the moment she became his, the wanting would evaporate, because the wanting was really only the thrill of the chase, the peak of the refusal, and had nothing to do with her at all. She had seen it in men before. The most ardent pursuer is often only a hunter, and the maddest passion cools the instant the quarry is caught. And Isabel, who had nothing in the world but her own clear sight, and her own hard-won dignity, was not about to hand both to a man who might be pursuing her, merely because she had bruised his pride, only to discard her when the bruise healed. She said as much to him, plainly, on a gray afternoon in the park, because plainness was the one currency they both trusted. "I am going to tell you what I think," she said, "because you have never once lied to me since the night of Lady Everley, and I will not lie to you now. I think you want me because I refused you. I think that the whole of this, the gifts, the arguing, the courting, is the peak of a man who has never been told no, and cannot bear that one nobody said it, and will not rest until he has made the nobody say yes. And I think that the moment I said yes, the moment I stopped refusing, the moment I became one more woman who wanted you, you would look at me and find that the thing you wanted was never me at all, but the refusal, and that with the refusal gone, there would be nothing left, and you would be bored, and I would be ruined, having given my heart to a man who only ever wanted the chase. That is what I think, Your Grace, and I would rather go on refusing you forever than test it and be right, because I have very little in this world, and my dignity is most of it, and I will not stake it on the guess that a man who collects what ignores him has, this once, actually fallen in love with the woman and not the ignoring." The Duke of Kern was quiet for a long moment. "That," he said at last, "is a very intelligent fear, and I have asked myself the same question, because I am not a fool, and I know what I have been, so I will not insult you by simply denying it. I will tell you instead how I know you are wrong, and you may weigh it as you like." He stopped walking and turned to her. "You are right that I first noticed you because you refused me. I will not pretend otherwise. A man accustomed to being chased is stopped in his tracks by the one who does not chase. That is true, and it is not to my credit. But Isabel, that is why I noticed you. It is not why I love you. I noticed you because you refused my hand. I fell in love with you because of why you refused it, because you had watched me abandon a frightened old woman, and decided you would rather be ruined than reward it. Do you understand the difference? A woman who refused me out of coyness, or strategy, or to make herself interesting, I would have tired of in a week, exactly as you fear. That would have been a game. And games do bore me, but you did not refuse me as a game. You refused me out of principle, at genuine cost to yourself, to defend a woman who could do nothing for you. That is not a thing that stops being true once you say yes. Your goodness, your fierce, clear honesty, the way you cannot bear cruelty even when bearing it would be safer. Those are not the chase, Isabel. Those are you. And they will still be there the day after you accept me, and the year after, and the decade after, because they are your character and not your strategy. I do not want the refusal. I want the woman who was capable of the refusal, and she does not vanish when the refusing stops. That is how I know. I have examined it as coldly as you have, because you taught me to, and that is the answer I keep arriving at. I fell in love not with the no, but with the reason for the no, and the reason is permanent. Isabel Crane stared at him, because it was, she realized, exactly the right answer, the only answer that could have reached her, and she had not expected the cold Duke of Cairn to have understood her fear so precisely, or to have thought it through so honestly, or to have arrived at the one distinction that made all the difference. That was well argued, she admitted, unsteadily. I have had an excellent teacher these 2 months, said the Duke of Cairn, the best in 3 kingdoms. She refuses me constantly, and it has improved my mind beyond measure. There was one call they paid together, some weeks before the king's ball, that Isabel remembered ever after as the moment she knew past all her careful fears, what manner of man the Duke of Cairn had become. He asked her one afternoon whether she would accompany him to call upon Lady Everley. Isabel had been surprised. She had assumed the Duke's half-hour of penance at the ball had been the end of that account, but the Duke, it transpired, had not left it there. He had called upon the old woman twice since, alone, quietly, telling no one, had discovered that she was lonely, and neglected by the son who found her a burden, and frightened of the grand cold world, and had, without fuss, begun to look in on her. And now he asked Isabel to come because, he said, with the awkwardness that still overtook him whenever he tried to speak of feeling, he thought the old lady would like to meet the young woman who had defended her, and because he found he wanted Isabel to see that the thing she had shamed him into had not been a single gesture but a lasting change. So they went. And Isabel watched the Duke of Cairn, the coldest, proudest, most feared man in 3 kingdoms, sit for 2 hours with a deaf old woman in a shabby parlor, speaking loudly and patiently so she could hear, listening to her long, rambling stories of a court, 50 years gone, admiring the faded miniatures of a husband and children long dead, drawing her out, making her laugh, treating her, in short, as though she were the most important person in the kingdom, and he had nowhere in the world he would rather be. There was no audience. There was no advantage. There was no one to impress but Isabel, and Isabel understood, watching, that he would have done it exactly the same had she not been there, because it had stopped being a performance weeks ago and become simply who he was learning to be. And old Lady Everley, at the end of the visit, took Isabel's hand in her frail one and drew her close and said, in the too loud voice of the very deaf, "He told me it was you, my dear, that night at the ball, when he came and sat with me. Everyone had seen him walk away from me, and I had gone home to weep over it, an old fool crying because a great man found her tiresome. And then weeks later he calls on me, and he tells me the whole story, that a young lady had refused to dance with him because he had been unkind to me, and had shamed him into coming back. You did that, for me, a stranger, an old deaf nobody, that not one soul in that room thought worth a moment's notice. You risked everything you had to defend my dignity, and you did not even know my name." The old eyes were wet. "I have lived 80 years, child, and been at the heart of the court, and known the great and the grand, and I will tell you that not once in 80 years, has anyone put themselves at risk to defend me. You are the first, and you did it for nothing, expecting nothing, when I could do nothing for you. Marry him, my dear, if he asks you, and I think he will. Not because he is a duke, but because a man who can be turned back toward kindness by the sight of goodness is a man worth having. And a woman who is good at cost, for strangers, when no one is watching, is a treasure beyond any fortune. I should know. I have watched the other kind for 80 years. And Isabel, driving home beside the Duke in the fading light, had been unable to speak for a while, and the Duke had let her have the silence. And then she had said quietly, "You did not have to keep calling on her. No one would ever have known if you had not. You did it when no one was watching. You taught me," the Duke said simply, "that what a man does when no one is watching is the only true measure of him. I have spent my life performing greatness for an audience. I am trying to learn to be good without one. I am not very accomplished at it yet, but I find I would rather be a man who calls on Lady Everley when no one knows than a man the whole court calls great. You did that. Before I met you, I did not know there was a difference." And Isabel had looked at him in the dusk of the carriage and understood that she had lost, entirely and joyfully, the long fight against her own heart, that she loved him, this remade man, and that the fear which had guarded her for so long had finally, quietly, laid itself down, because you cannot go on believing a man wants only the chase when you have watched him sit for 2 hours with a deaf old woman for no reason but kindness, with no one watching but you. The reckoning came, as it so often does, from a woman who had wanted the Duke for herself. Her name was Lady Sophronia Vane, and she was the reigning beauty of the court, and she had spent 3 years in the confident expectation that she would, in the end, be the one to bring the great Duke of Kiern to heel and become his Duchess. And she had watched, over one incredulous autumn, that expectation collapse in favor of a penniless nobody, a nothing, a poor relation who had risen from being ignored by the whole court to being courted by the most powerful man in it. Lady Sophronia found this intolerable, and being clever and cruel and well-connected, she set about doing something to it. Her weapon was the very fear Isabel had confessed to the Duke, the fear that she was only a schemer who had played hard to get. Lady Sophronia could not know Isabel had confessed it, but she understood, with the instinct of the malicious, that it was the vulnerable point, and she aimed there. She began to spread, through the court's whispering machinery, a story that Isabel Crane's famous refusal had been no principled thing at all, but a calculated gambit, the oldest trick in the book, a clever nobody's scheme to make herself interesting to a jaded Duke by being the one woman to say no, that the whole business with Lady Everley had been a piece of theater, a performance of virtue staged to snare a man who could be caught no other way. It was poison, and it was clever, because it took the truest and finest thing Isabel had done and recast it as manipulation, and it aimed to make the Duke doubt the one thing his love was built on, that her refusal had been real. And Lady Sophronia arranged for it to come to a head at the greatest event of the season, the king's own birthday ball. The whole court assembled, where she intended, publicly, to expose Isabel Crane as a scheming fortune huntress and shame her out of the court forever. She made her move in the middle of the ball, loudly, before the assembled aristocracy of 3 kingdoms, in the cruelest possible terms, turning to Isabel across a crowded floor and saying, with poisonous sweetness, that it was so clever, so very clever, the way dear Miss Crane had caught the Duke by pretending to refuse him, that they had all admired the performance, that it was quite the most brilliant piece of husband hunting the court had seen in years, and that Miss Crane really must share her secret with the other ambitious nobodies, since it had worked so spectacularly. It was designed to do to Isabel exactly what Isabel had once accused the Duke of doing to Lady Everley, to humiliate a person of no power before the whole court, for sport, for advantage, and the court held its breath to watch the nobody crumble. Isabel did not crumble, but neither did she get the chance to defend herself, because the Duke of Kiern was already speaking. He had crossed the floor to stand beside her, and he addressed not Isabel, but Lady Sophronia, and not quietly, and the whole court fell silent to hear the Duke of Kiern, cold and terrible, as he had been in the old days before Isabel had begun to remake him, only now the coldness was pointed where it belonged. "Lady Sophronia," he said, "you have just informed this entire court that Miss Crane's refusal of me, some months ago, was a calculated scheme to catch me. I am the person best placed in the world to know whether that is true, being the man who was refused, and I am going to settle it now, publicly, because a lie told loudly must be answered loudly, and I have learned that lesson, among a great many others, from the very woman you are trying to destroy. So attend, all of you, because I will say at once." He looked out over the court. When Miss Crane refused my hand, she was a penniless girl entirely at the mercy of everyone in this room. She had nothing, no fortune, no protector, no consequence. And I was, as you all know, a man who could have crushed her with a word, and was, at that moment, visibly inclined to. Refusing me was not a clever path to catching me. It was, by every rational calculation, an act of certain self-destruction. No fortune huntress in the history of the world has ever pursued a duke by publicly insulting him at the risk of her own ruin. That is not how the game is played, as Lady Sophronia, who has played it expertly for 3 years, knows perfectly well. Miss Crane refused me for one reason and one reason only, which I witnessed and which half of you witnessed, because she had just watched me abandon a frightened, deaf old woman, Lady Everley, in this very court, and she decided she would rather be ruined than take the hand of a man capable of such a cruelty. She defended a powerless old woman at the direct risk of her own destruction, expecting nothing, gaining nothing, and very nearly losing everything. That is not a scheme, Lady Sophronia. That is the single most honorable thing I have witnessed in 15 years at this court, and it shamed me into becoming a better man, and I have loved her for it every day since." His voice dropped, but it carried. "You have tried to recast her goodness as manipulation, because you cannot conceive of goodness that is not manipulation, because you have never in your life done a kind thing that was not calculated for advantage, and so you assume no one else has either. But you have miscalculated, madam, badly, because in trying to prove Miss Crane a schemer, you have only proven yourself one, publicly, before the king, and you have handed me the perfect occasion to do the thing I have wanted to do for a month, and lacked only the courage." And the Duke of Kern turned from the whitening Lady Sophronia to Isabel Crane, and, in the middle of the king's birthday ball, before the whole assembled court, the very court that had watched her refuse him, he went down on one knee. The court made a sound like a great indrawn breath. "Isabel Crane," said the Duke of Kern, kneeling before the nobody he had once expected to command, "some months ago I offered you my hand as a favor, from a great height, and you refused it. And you were right to, because the man who offered it was not worth taking. I have spent every day since trying to become a man whose hand might be worth taking. You have been remaking me, whether you meant to or not, and I am immeasurably the better for it. So I am going to offer it again, humbly this time, from my knees, in front of everyone who watched you refuse me, so that there can be no doubt in any mind, ever, about what this is. I am not asking you because you refused me. I am asking you because you were the kind of woman who would refuse me, because you are good, and fierce, and honest, and you cannot bear cruelty, and you defended a stranger at the cost of yourself, and you have made me kinder, and made me see, and made me, for the first time in my life, want to be worthy of someone. I love you, not the no, you. Refuse me again if you like. I will deserve it, and I will keep trying. But I have rather hoped for a month, that I might have made myself, by now, into a man whose hand you could take without shame. Will you have me, Isabel? Not the duke you refused, the man you made. Will you?" And Isabel Crane looked down at the Duke of Kern, kneeling before her in the middle of the court, the cold, proud, cruel man she had refused, remade by the refusing, into someone humble enough to kneel before a nobody, and thank her for it. And she understood that her fear had been answered not in words, but in the whole shape of him, in the months of change, in the fact that the man kneeling before her was demonstrably not the man she had refused, that her no had not been collected and discarded, but had been heard, and had worked its slow transformation, and had produced this, a better man, on his knees, asking to be taken not as a conqueror, but as her own creation. "You have improved considerably, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was not steady, and there were tears in it, and the whole court leaned in to hear. "When I refused you, you were a man who left old women standing alone, and now you are a man who kneels before a nobody, in front of the king, and calls her his equal and his better. That is a great deal of improvement in a few months. I did not think it could be done. I did not think proud, cold men could be remade at all. I thought them fixed like stone. You have proven me wrong, and I find I do not mind being wrong. This once. She reached down and took his face in her hands, there on the floor of the court. So yes, I will have you. Not the Duke I refused, who was not worth having, but the man you have become, who is. Yes, and I give you fair warning, Julian. I do not intend to stop refusing you things. I shall refuse you constantly, for the rest of your life, whenever you are wrong, exactly as I have these 2 months, because it is plainly the only thing that keeps you decent, and I have grown fond of you decent. You may have my hand. You may not have my silence. Those are my terms. Those, said the Duke of Kieran, rising and drawing her up with him, are the only terms I want. A wife who will refuse me when I am wrong is worth more than 3 kingdoms of women who would agree with me when I am. I have had the agreement. It nearly turned me to stone. I will take the refusal, gladly, for the rest of my life. And he kissed her, in the middle of the king's birthday ball, before the whole astonished court, and the court, which had assembled to watch a nobody destroyed, found itself watching instead the most powerful man in 3 kingdoms marry the penniless girl who had refused him, and even the hardest hearts in that glittering room were, for a moment, moved, because there is nothing the world loves so much as a proud man humbled by love into becoming good. Lady Sophronia Vane left the ball early, and was not much missed, and found, as all the cruel in these tales find, that her attempt to destroy her rival had only elevated her, that the whole court now told the story of the Duke's kneeling proposal as the great romance of the age, and that she herself featured in it only as the jealous schemer whose malice had provoked it. She had reached for the last weapon, and it had turned in her hand, as it always does. They were married that winter, and Isabel Crane, who had entered the court a nobody ignored by everyone, left it a duchess. But she was never, to the end of her life, the kind of duchess who forgot she had been a nobody. That was the making of her, and of him. For the Duchess of Kieran used her great new consequence for exactly one purpose above all others, the defense of the powerless against the powerful, which was the thing that had made the Duke fall in love with her in the first place, and which she now practiced on a scale her refusing days could never have dreamed. There was no frightened old woman abandoned in a corner, no servant humiliated, no nobody ignored, within the vast reach of the Duke and Duchess of Kieran, that the Duchess did not see and lift and defend, because she had been the nobody in the corner, and she never forgot it, and she had learned, in one extraordinary evening, exactly how much a single person's refusal to accept cruelty could change. And the Duke, the cold, proud, cruel Duke of Kieran, whom the whole court had feared, became, under his wife's unrelenting and beloved refusals, one of the most just and generous men in the kingdom, a man who was known to seek out the dull and the frightened and the overlooked at every gathering, and give them his complete attention, because his wife had taught him, on the night she refused his hand, that how a powerful man treats those who can do nothing for him is the whole and only measure of him. He never forgot Lady Everley. He endowed, in her name, a home for aged gentlewomen of small means, so that no frightened old woman need ever again sit alone and ignored in a cold grand room. And he did it, he always said, in honor of the 2 women who had taught him everything, the old one he had wronged and the young one who had refused to let him. Late in their long marriage, a young woman of the court, poor and proud, and lately arrived, and much in need of guidance, asked the old Duchess how she had done it, how a nobody had come to marry the greatest man in 3 kingdoms. I refused him, the Duchess of Kieran said simply. That is the whole of it, and it is not the advice you are hoping for, so let me explain it, because it is not what it sounds like. I did not refuse him as a strategy. That is the thing the schemers never understand, and it is why their schemes fail. I refused him because he had done something cruel, and I could not bear it, and I would rather have been ruined than rewarded. The refusal was not a move in a game. It was the truth, spoken at cost, expecting nothing. And that, the truth spoken at cost, expecting nothing, is the one thing in this world that a jaded, powerful man has never encountered and cannot resist, not because it is clever, but because it is real, and the powerful are starved half to death for anything real. So I will give you the only counsel I have, my dear, and it is not a strategy, because the moment it becomes a strategy, it stops working. It is this: do not scheme to be wanted. Simply be good, at cost, when no one is watching and nothing is to be gained. And if a proud man happens to see it, and has any soul left in him at all, it will undo him completely, because it is the one thing all his power could never buy, and all his rank never earned. I refused a duke's hand to defend an old woman, and I lost nothing and gained everything, and I would do it again 1,000 times. Be good when it costs you. That is the whole secret. There is no other. And across the room, the Duke of Cairn, who had of course been listening, for he had spent 30 years listening to every word his wife said, having learned the hard way that she was nearly always right, caught her eye, and inclined his head, in the same short, precise bow he had given her on the night she refused him, the bow of a man acknowledging a hit. And the Duchess of Cairn smiled back at him, the fierce, clear smile that had remade 3 kingdoms worth of a man, and refused, out of long habit and pure affection, to look the least bit humble about it.